Yes, they were.
This is Michael. He runs a YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy that focuses on Christian apologetics. And he's about to react to one of my earliest YouTube shorts that provides my argument for why the gospel writers of the New Testament are anonymous. And his reaction? Let's just say it leaves a little to be desired in the area of facts. Now, obviously, we're not going to see eye to eye, but before I tear into his views, let me just say this. I actually like the Inspiring Philosophy channel. I follow them because it's clear that they do their research. Now, as you'll see, I think they rely a little too heavily on individual authors, but they don't make claims without at least having something to point to that backs them up. Of course, just because you have something to point to doesn't make you right, as you're about to see. Let's get this party started. Another thing Christians don't understand about their Bible is that the Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes, they were. In fact, one of the best arguments for traditional authorship is that we have unanimous attestation from church fathers. The scholar Simon Gathercole talks about this in his paper, that from various different geographical regions, all early church fathers in the first few hundred years of Christianity agree that the gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If the Gospels were originally known as anonymous and traditional authorship was made up later, then the discussion about who wrote them should have been like the discussion about who wrote Hebrews, which is truly anonymous. Church fathers were not sure who wrote that book. But when it came to the Gospels, they were all in agreement that the authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, despite them writing in various different geographical regions. In fact, there is a ton of evidence to support traditional authorship in the reliability of the Gospels, which we discuss in our 15-part series, which is over 6 hours of content, and you can find it on our channel.
Let's slow this down for a second. Michael claims that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because later church fathers said so.
Is that we have unanimous attestation from church fathers.
And they all seem to agree. But is that really compelling evidence? Think about this. The earliest gospel manuscripts we have, like P52, don't name an author, no Matthew, no Mark, just the text. The names were added later, and all of the so-called unanimous attestation comes after the first century. By that point, the church was already invested in giving these texts apostolic authority, so of course they agreed, because disagreement would have undermined their theological project. And the comparison to Hebrews actually proves my point. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, and the early church admitted that. But with the Gospels, they had a motivation to not admit uncertainty. Naming apostles gave the text weight. That's not evidence of authorship, it's evidence of branding. So no, quoting church fathers 2 or 3 centuries later doesn't prove anything about who actually wrote the Gospels. It proves what later Christians wanted to believe. All of the Gospels are anonymous, and scholars agree about this. Even your favorite scholar, Wes Huff, agrees on this point.
You sure about that?
Yeah, I'm sure. Here's an article from Wes Huff's website. In it, he admits the majority of modern New Testament scholarship today believe that the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were originally penned and circulated anonymously. Now, Wes questions the evidence and then goes on to quote, "This is not to say that Pesch and the majority of scholars' assertions regarding gospel authorship and anonymity could not be true. It could be." And then he goes into a whole section that argues that even if the Gospels are anonymous, it changes nothing about his beliefs about the doctrine that they contain. Now, he would have no reason to make this argument at all if there was sufficient evidence to prove that the Gospels are actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But let's see how you guys try to twist this one. All of the Gospels are anonymous, and scholars agree about this. Even your favorite scholar, Wes Huff, agrees on this point.
You sure about that? Because I messaged Wes, sent him your video, and asked if he agreed. Here's what he had to say. I do not believe that. Not in the way he's articulating it. They are formally anonymous, insofar as if you take the title off the top of the gospel and just read the text, you wouldn't necessarily know any one of the ascribed authors was the author. But guess what? That's true for everything in the ancient world, apart from potentially the two exceptions of Historia Augusta, Life of Aulus, and Lucian's Passing of Peregrine. Of the 60 biographies surviving of Plutarch, none identify Plutarch as the author internally within the body of the text. Do we go around saying that all Plutarch's writings are anonymous? No. When we read lives, we refer to them as Plutarch's lives.
A major problem with the theory of complete gospel anonymity is the utter implausibility that the book was circulating around the Roman Empire as prolifically as the Gospels did without a title for almost 100 years and could somehow at some point be attributed to exactly the same author by scribes in completely different geographical areas and yet leave no trace of disagreements in any of the manuscripts.
And there are numerous other scholars that argue the Gospels were not known as anonymous, like Simon Gathercole, Mike Lacona, Martin Hengel, D.A. Carson, Brant Petrie, Luke Vandewey, Craig Blomberg, and many others.
So Michael messaged Wes Huff. Great. And Wes confirmed exactly what I said. The Gospels are formally anonymous. Meaning, when you read the text itself, there's no internal claim of authorship. No, I'm Matthew, or this is John writing to you, just the narrative. Now, Wes tries to downplay this by saying that that's true for most ancient works, but it doesn't actually help his case. It hurts it. Because when historians study ancient biographies, like those by Plutarch, they don't just assume the attributions are correct. They evaluate them. They look at the manuscript evidence, citations by early sources, the style, the vocabulary, and the context. And the same scrutiny applies to the Gospels. And when we apply it, we find no direct internal claim of authorship, no early attributions from the first century, and zero independent eyewitness testimony. Just later church tradition. As for the claim that titles couldn't have been added later without disagreement, that's just not how ancient book copying worked. Early manuscripts didn't always circulate with covers or consistent labels. Titles could and were added by scribes, especially when a community wanted to assign authority to a text. The lack of early manuscript diversity isn't proof of authorship. It's proof of how quickly tradition took hold. So, yes, Wes Huff agrees the Gospels are anonymous, and no, quoting a list of conservative scholars doesn't erase that fact. Think about this for just a second. Who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? The followers of Jesus, these were regular people in that day.
This guy's getting his history wrong. Mark and Luke were not direct disciples of Jesus. They were men who followed the apostles. And Luke was a physician, which means he would have been educated. Papias says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, which means he also would likely have been educated. Matthew was a tax collector, so he would also have had some form of education. That leaves the disciple John, who could have just gained an education later in life, or he could have wrote through a scribe. Even educated people did this, like Seneca or Paul. So even if you couldn't read or write, you could still send off letters or write books by hiring a scribe to help you compose something.
Let's clear something up. The point I made is that if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were real individuals connected directly to Jesus or the apostles, they were not elite scholars or professional authors. They were regular people, working class, rural Jews in a largely oral culture. Now, Michael wants to correct me by saying, actually, Mark and Luke weren't disciples, and Luke was a physician, but he's missing the real issue. None of these people, as described in tradition, were the kind of highly educated Greek writers capable of producing the polished literary works we see in the Gospels. We're talking about sophisticated Greek compositions, especially Luke, which uses advanced vocabulary and literary structure. It doesn't come from a Galilean tax collector like Matthew. It doesn't come from a fisherman like John. And saying that they could have used a scribe doesn't bridge that gap. You can hire a scribe to write down what you say, but you don't dictate nuanced Greek prose with editorial finesse and theological layering unless you already know how to write that way. And citing Papias? Let's not forget, Papias is writing almost a century after Jesus, and even early church fathers like Eusebius called him unreliable. So again, Pointing to tradition or hypothetical scribes doesn't answer the core question. Who had the skills to write these texts? Because if it wasn't the named apostles or their close friends, then traditional authorship collapses under its own weight. They spoke Aramaic, but the authors of the Gospels, these were educated people. They spoke Greek, and not just regular Greek, almost a poetic version of Greek. They were highly educated.
First off, scholars like Stanley Porter and Peter J. Williams note many Jews in the first century were bilingual, meaning they spoke Aramaic and Greek, and this includes Jesus and his disciples. Williams even makes an interesting case that the Sermon on the Mount was given by Jesus in Greek. Second, the Gospels are not highly sophisticated ancient biographies. They are popular level biographies. Mark's Greek is actually quite rough and simple. Charles Quarles notes that the education required to write Matthew's Gospel would not have needed to be that complex. And again, the Gospel authors could have simply hired scribes to help them write, compose, and structure their works.
Let's talk about language and literacy, because Michael claims that Jews in the first century were bilingual and that maybe even Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount in Greek. That's a stretch. Now, could some Jews speak Greek? Sure, especially in urban or Hellenized areas, but the idea that Galilean fishermen or a tax collector were fluent enough to compose complex Greek narratives, it's a different level entirely. We're not talking about conversational Greek. We're talking about literary Greek, structured, polished, theologically loaded prose, and that's just not something you pick up. And the claim that the Gospels are popular level biographies, that's misleading. Mark might be simpler in style, yes, but Luke and Matthew are significantly more advanced. Luke especially shows signs of education in rhetoric, historiography, and structured narrative design. This isn't graffiti on a wall Greek. This is someone trained in elite writing techniques. As for hiring scribes, again, that doesn't solve the problem. You can dictate to a scribe, but you can't outsource literacy. You can't hire a scribe to organize complex theological arguments or craft parallel literary structures unless you understand them yourself. So no, saying that they spoke Greek or used scribes doesn't bridge the gap between rural, Aramaic-speaking peasants and the authors of these polished texts. It just raises more questions about who really wrote the Gospels. It matters because it draws into question, were these actually eyewitnesses of these events, or did they hear it from someone else and wrote it down later?
We have a ton of evidence the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony and are incredibly reliable. See our 15 video series, which is over 6 hours long, for a ton of evidence.
Really? Then why not name any of it? That's the problem. You see, apologists will often say this, but when you press for specifics, it boils down to a handful of weak or circular claims. Let's look at the usual suspects. First, they point to Papias. We talked about him. It's a 2nd century bishop writing decades after the Gospels were written. He claims Mark wrote down Peter's memories, and Matthew wrote in Hebrew dialect, which doesn't even match the Greek Gospel of Matthew that we have today. That's not eyewitness evidence. It's hearsay about hearsay. Next, they often appeal to undesigned coincidences, tiny overlaps between the Gospels that supposedly prove eyewitness accuracy, but in reality, these are just narrative similarities in text that clearly copied from one another. If Matthew is borrowing from Mark, then of course you'll see overlaps. And then there's the claim that the Gospels sound like eyewitness accounts. But sounding true isn't the same as being true. Historical fiction can feel vivid and real too. And finally, there's the appeal to consensus scholars like Richard Bauckham, who argues the Gospels preserve named eyewitness testimony. But even Bauckham's work is controversial among mainstream scholars, and many reject it, precisely because it lacks hard evidence and leans on speculation. So let's be honest. If there really were a ton of strong, direct evidence that the Gospels were based on eyewitness accounts, then Christian apologists wouldn't need 15 videos to prove it. They just need one good source from the 1st century that said, I saw this and I wrote it down. But we don't have that. What we have is tradition, inference, and of course, apologetics. Now, I know Michael and I aren't going to see eye to eye on this one, and that's okay. He has a channel with 15 videos that go through the New Testament. Check them out. We also have an 8-video series called New Testament for Skeptics that's on this channel that you can also check out to look at the skeptic's point of view. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the details. Let's look at the real context that Christians don't actually want to talk about. That's what this channel is all about, asking the questions. So, Michael, thanks for responding to the short. The ball's back in your court, my friend. Looking forward to hearing from you soon. It's been another episode of Faith in Question. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys later.